Okay. So here we are. We only have 2 review sessions left. Tomorrow I'll probably have a little Kahoot for you. Today we'll try to get through at least sections A and B. And this is a pretty important one because development especially we only covered in 3 days and we didn't take a test on it. Industrialization we're doing right now and you have a test on Friday. So it's good that you're here. It'll help you on Friday and of course for the AP test. So the first thing I wanted to start with is just some of these key concepts here, just as a little introduction. When we think about industrialization and the economic globalization that came about because of industrialization, look at what that first sentence says. Maps that use nation-state lines miss what is distinctive about globalization. When we're talking about the global economy, the economy is more connected through cities and through powerful corporations that control all of these commodity chains. Some of these companies are more powerful than countries. So when it says maps that use nation states miss what is distinctive, it's not about countries per se. All right? And that's why we're seeing an increase in trading blocs and groups like supranational organizations, the EU or NAFTA. Right? 'Cause this is about trade. This is about spreading out your production process to make the most money possible. And so that's what I mean that when I say nation-state lines miss what is distinctive about globalization. Sure, there is this core regions, Japan, North America, and Europe, right? Those are the core regions of the world that make most of these production decisions, but it really operates throughout the world, through world cities and all of these major industrial regions that you guys have been learning about. And you should be able to pick out those industrial regions from the PowerPoint that we did last week in class. Okay, and so another last connection here. The world is so linked, it's so connected, right? And we're going to take you through some of these changes in power, in energy, and in technology that allows us to be so connected. Because of that, we have spread out this production process. And that's really key to this new international division of labor, right? That the decisions are made in one place, right? And the white-collar jobs are in one place. The production is taking place elsewhere. The assembly is taking place elsewhere, right? And then containerized shipping is allowing that to go everywhere. So that's just like a little introduction to industrialization. Now, development, of course, plays a role in your level of development, how you fit into that production process. So we'll be looking at ways of measuring development as well. All right, so part A here is really about the Industrial Revolution, its diffusion, and increased standards of living that it brought with it. So you have here the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, beginning in the UK about 1750. All right, so that's under number 1 here. And the inventions that were created, especially the steam engine, changes the way, for instance, textiles were produced. Before the Industrial Revolution, everything was done in your house. This was called cottage industry. So it was dispersed across the landscape, right? People created their woven cloth in their own homes, right? Once you have the Industrial Revolution and you have large machines at first that can't be used in somebody's home, you're going to be moving them to particular spots, especially where the coal is plentiful. All right, and that's what I mean when I say factories cluster around the raw materials and energy. They did use water power at first. All right, so initially you can see some of these mills popping up near rivers. But once they figure out how to use coal as an energy source, the entire population of Europe shifts to move towards those coal fields because coal is heavy, right? So you don't want to move the coal to your factory. You're going to build the factory near the coal fields. All right, and so this is the beginning of industrial cities. This is linked to stuff we've talked about in agriculture. You have to become better farmers to free up a labor force, right? And so once that happens, there's enough people to begin working in these factories. And by the way, once there's more food, you have a more stable food supply, You're going to increase life expectancy. So all of this stuff is connected. The technology and energy that they discovered, the iron ore that England has a lot of, right? The UK has a lot of iron ore, which is the main input for making steel. Without steel, you have no industrial revolution. All right, so those two energy sources, well, this energy source and mineral are super important for why the Industrial Revolution started in England, and there's other reasons too. England had colonies. England was getting raw materials from them, and industrialization only created the need for more colonies because they needed more cotton, they needed more raw materials from their empire, and they wanted that market as well. They wanted to take all the raw materials in from their colonies, and they wanted to sell finished goods. So all of these chapters are kind of coming together now. And this is what I was alluding to before. This is the third thing down. The diffusion of industrialization led to growing populations. All right, so that second agricultural revolution allows for the industrial revolution. Right? The increased food supply and the technology that comes with the industrial revolution bring down what? Birth rates or death rates? Death rates, right? So look, birth rate is still high in stage 2. But this change here, the death rates that plunge during stage 2 create this high natural increase rate. And that's what that third section means right there. The diffusion of industrialization led to growing populations, increased food supply, which freed workers to seek industrial jobs in cities. Okay, so I feel like at this point in Human Geo, everything's coming together. We're talking about population, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about industrialization. And that's what happens at the end of the class. Hopefully you're starting to see those connections. All right, so that was number 1 from part A. Number 2 is pretty easy, I think. We've been practicing this, but we're going to throw in 2 more sectors. So, before I have you do this, I want to make sure everybody knows primary, secondary, tertiary, and then the 2 new ones, quaternary and quinary. So, they're listed here for you. Primary is anything you do to extract things or grow things from the earth. Secondary is when you take those raw materials and you process them, right? You turn them into something else. So manufacturing. Tertiary is services. Now, we haven't made you in class do the quaternary or quinary part. They're subsectors, essentially, of tertiary. So with tertiary, you have general services, and it could encompass quaternary and quinary, but you could specialize those out and say that the quaternary jobs are the white-collar jobs. Right? These are the types of services that require knowledge, that require an education. And then quinary, those they call the gold-collar jobs. Those are the researchers. Those are the CEOs. Those are the professors. Okay, those are the top government officials. They're all still services, but they're more specialized. All right, so let's practice. Teacher. Yes, quaternary, right? Because I have to have a college degree to be teaching you, so it's not just tertiary. Vehicle production. You're making cars. Who are you? Secondary. Secondary, good. What about a CEO? Quinary. That's the top dog, right? The quinary. The minor. Primary. I could have said farmer. I could have said fisherman. That's the primary. And the auto mechanic. Not secondary. They're providing a service, right? They're providing a service. They're not making your car. They're fixing it. So they're providing you a service. So that's tertiary. Or they're working with their hands. Sometimes they're called blue-collar jobs. There you go. So that's number 2. Now let's do the practice question. Turn to somebody after you look at it. I'll give you a minute to figure out the answer to practice question there at the bottom of page 1. All right, what's your guess? C. Yay, quaternary. Okay, so you're collecting, processing, working with information, not working with your hands, right? You're not transforming raw materials, that would be secondary. Extracting would be primary. Exchange of goods and services, that would be tertiary. That would be somebody who's working at a store, right? And again, production of fresh produce would be primary. So that's a sample question that came from an old AP test. I just want you to see how these apply. All right, so going on to page 2, this is number 3. We just learned about this guy, and your book left him out, which is crazy, because here he is on the rubric of things we need to teach you. Weber, some people call him Weber, but he's German, so Weber's least cost theory. The point of number 3 here is to explain industrial location. So now we know where it started in the UK and why, right, and what it needed. But today, how do you explain industrial location? And that's what this model is all about. Notice that it says it emphasizes the owner's desire to minimize transport and labor costs and maximize agglomeration economies. So as an owner of a business, a factory, whatever it is you're making, you have to decide where you're going to make the most money. And that's what this model is all about. So your number 1 category, the most important category according to the model, is transportation. And there's many things that go into that. So we'll talk about getting your raw materials, your inputs to the factory. That's a cost, especially if those raw materials are heavy, right? Or your finished good. After you're done with production, how are you going to get that to the market? How are you going to get that to stores and consumers? Right? So distance and weight all go into this transportation category. The second category is labor. Who are you going to hire? And it depends what you're making. You might need really educated people. Right? So you're going to be attracted to a city that has an agglomeration or a concentration of people with that particular skill. Maybe you just need cheap labor. And because of containerized shipping, you might go across the ocean to get cheap labor in Asia because the containerized shipping is so cheap, right? And then agglomeration. Remember, that means the clustering of businesses of the same sort in the same spot because they support each other and reduce the costs. There's a talent level that's located there. There's support services that are located there. Always think about Hollywood, right? All of these movie stars and production facilities and expertise, all of that technology, that's already there. So if you're going to make a movie, it makes a lot of sense to do it in a spot like Hollywood. All right, so this is least cost theory. And I have a couple more slides that relate to that, and they often ask questions about bulk gaining and bulk reducing. So the little paragraph underneath the first one talks about bulk reducing first. Activities having a high level of raw materials tend to cluster near the supply, such as aluminum, such as copper. All right, so those are heavy. Those raw materials are heavy. You need a lot of them. And so you're going to locate your factory near those resources. Or in the case of aluminum, they always talk about aluminum needing a lot of power. So near the energy sources. So with aluminum factories, they tend to be near dams because they can get cheap electricity from hydroelectricity. So this is bulk reducing. This picture on the copper stuff is in your book. Think about how heavy copper is. It needs to be refined. Right? So you're not going to put your production facilities near the market. You're going to put them near the mines. And then bulk gaining. Gains weight during production. It says here that activities using ubiquitous raw materials like water, right? So water can be found everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So if you're making Coke, you're going to have production facilities across the country because why would you ship water? Right? You're going to make it near the people all over. It's bulk gaining. All right. Cars are a little different. The end product with cars is also heavy. So you're going to locate your car manufacturing near the middle of the country so that you don't have to transport your finished product all the way across the country. And that's why we see cars in the Midwest, to minimize the end transport cost of that bulk gaining product. All right, so try to keep those two straight and realize how they link into the transportation costs of Weber's model, least cost theory. All right, now, before we go on to the practice questions, take a look at the critique. Some people are like, okay, just like with all these models that we talk about, understand them, be able to apply them, but then also know they're not perfect anymore. So in this case, it says the reduction of transport costs and new economic sectors. We're going to be talking about these technopoles, these high technology sectors. Maybe this model doesn't apply anymore. All right? But it still matters, especially for these bulk reducing industries. All right? So you can still learn something from the model, even if some modern day manufacturing isn't as concerned with transport costs. Okay, so I have 3 practice questions here that are all related to those concepts. Take a couple minutes to look at these 3 questions, talk to each other. Are you done? All right, so for the first one, which one of these is the answer? Locating close to raw materials, right? Which implies that it's what? Bulk what? Bulk reducing. C is right, the nickel smelting, right? It's similar to copper, say, right? You're going to process it, and it's heavy when it starts, and less heavy when it ends. And the word smelting, too, implies that. What about the second one? Low terminal costs. So wherever this pulls in, it's not expensive to maintain that connection, like the putting your products off and on it at the terminal. Or high route flexibility. That should be your key. High route flexibility. This form of transportation can go anywhere. It's very flexible. What is it? Truck. Right? So that the airplane wouldn't be, because it has to only go where airports are. So the airport would have high terminal costs. Think about maintaining, right, airport facilities. Whereas your truck can just pull right into any warehouse, load, unload, be on its way. And then the clustering. The word clustering should tip you off right away. Doctors' offices and pharmacies near hospitals. That's an example of what word? You got it. So it's C-A-B. Camp! All right. So that's section A. Right? The Industrial Revolution, as it diffused from its earth, facilitated improvements in standards of living. All right, all that stuff. All right, so we're going to go on to section B now. This is about development. So this is back to what we covered right after spring break. Anybody know what city that is? or place? It's Qatar. Awesome, isn't it? All right, so I'm going to start with this north-south split because B is about measures of development being used to understand patterns of social and economic differences. So we asked, well, which places are developed? So what came to my mind was this map that shows that most of the developed world is above this 30-degree line, 30 degrees north. Right? It's just a way of visualizing the split between more developed and less developed. Now, it's not perfect, right? Because you have Australia and New Zealand that are considered developed and are below 30 degrees north. But if you ever see that, the north-south split, they're talking about development. And Anglo-America, Europe, Japan, all above that line. Students often forget where the equator is. The equator is really pretty far south, right? Running through South America and Africa and parts of Indonesia. So try to keep this as a visual. And we're going to go through all of these different measures of development. So at the bottom of page 2, there's a list of things you have to know. And that's what my next few slides are going to be. So section 1 is going to be really long because you need to understand gross national income. We've already done the sectoral structure of an economy, but we're going to link that to development, income distribution, fertility rates, infant mortality rates, healthcare, literacy rates. These are all ways of figuring out if a place is developed or not. And if you combine them all into one measure, like HDI, that's even better. But understanding what each one of these things are and how that shows an aspect of development is the goal. All right, so we're going to do the first one because I doubt we remember gross national income. All right, so the indicator is GNI per capita, which simply means per person. So you take how productive the country is as a whole, and you divide it per capita. All right? But what is gross national income versus an indicator you might be more familiar with, like GDP, which is gross domestic product? It's actually that and more. So at the top of page 3, I have this little formula. GNI, which is gross national income, is GDP, which is the total of everything that's produced domestically in your country, so within the boundaries of the United States. That's GDP. The total value of everything that's made here in America. Okay? But you have to change that a little bit because this is about gross national income. So it's about things that are made by Americans, American companies, the way that American companies are profiting. So you add to the GDP any money that's coming in from American companies that are in foreign countries. It's pretty simple, right? We have companies all across the world. So any amount of money that they're making abroad counts as a part of our GNI. But then you have to do the opposite. You have to subtract money from foreign companies, right, that is made domestically in America. That's all it is. So it sounds confusing and the formula's like, what? But you're trying to figure out how profitable American corporations are and how productive Americans are. That's the whole point of GNI. That's it. So it's an economic indicator. How productive are we? And think about what that means for development. Think about all of our technology and machinery, like all of this stuff that we have, how efficient our farmers are. All of that, all of our manufacturing processes, right? All the services that we charge for, the total value. And that really does show development. All right? So, good. I think that that's hopefully makes sense to you. This next slide shows a visual choropleth of that, GNI per capita, and it shouldn't surprise you. Kind of look at where the north-south split is, right? Anglo-America, Europe, Australia, Japan, and then you have a couple Middle Eastern countries that are wealthy because of what? Oil, right? That's such a valuable commodity that their economic indicator, their GNI per capita, is really high. Plus, those places aren't heavily populated, so when you're talking per person basis, they make, it looks really good on paper. But remember, this is just one aspect of development. Life for women in those countries, not so good, right? And so we're going to be looking for a better indicator that has an overall picture, not just economic. The last thing I wanted to say about GNI is that you have to be aware of it at a scale level. So I could give this example of China, and it shows that coastal China, right, way more productive, because that's where all the factories are, all the special economic zones, right? And so yes, they're going to be a lot higher. Hong Kong here is comparable to the United States, actually. Whereas the interior of China, like Tibet, not much going on economically. So keep that in mind anytime you're thinking about any indicator. If you change scale, you'll get a more clear picture. And I included, no, that was it. Okay, so I included in your packet here on page 3 this list of GNI and GNI per capita. Notice that Hong Kong on your sheet there is just above the United States per capita. So that part of China is super productive, right? But China as a whole isn't even on this list, even though they have over 1 billion people, because they're still a developing country. So you do not by any means have to memorize this list, but look at the countries that are on it. Qatar, Luxembourg, Singapore, Norway, Switzerland. There's the US, the Netherlands, right? Very productive, developed countries. All right. The next section, the sectoral structure of the economy, you already know the sectors of the economy now. So how does it apply to development? This is really easy. Countries that have a lot more people working in the tertiary sector, services, they're the developed countries. Right? This one is the United States. Right? And then as you go to the semi-periphery, now we're in Brazil. Sure, there's still a lot of people working in services, but a lot more working in the primary sector. In America, it's 2% of our population is in primary. Less than 2%, actually. Right? Brazil, a much larger percentage. And then Nepal, 80% of people are doing primary activities here. Very few people are doing tertiary. So understanding the sectors of the economy and how that relates to development, I think is really straightforward. As these sectors of the economy change, it shows development. It shows that people no longer need to farm, that farming has become more advanced and fewer people can do it more efficiently, freeing up a labor force to work in manufacturing, right? And then eventually people don't want to do that anymore. You guys don't want to work in factories when you're older, you don't think? Maybe you want to run the line or design the line. Most of us are going to work in services, and that's a sign of a developed economy. Pretty easy one. Okay, so I included that on your note sheet. Let's go on. What's another indicator of development? Income distribution. Okay, so sometimes it looks like a country is developed, but all of the people that have the wealth, right, may be a very select few. And so they use something called the Gini coefficient here as a measure of development to show income distribution. So if the Gini coefficient is 0, that means the income is spread equally across a country. That would be like pure communism, which never works because the elite communist party leaders take more for themselves. But in an ideal communist world, everybody would share equally. There would be perfect equality. If the Gini coefficient is 1, which means 100%, that would mean that one person has all of the income. Okay? And so when we look at income disparity, meaning which countries are more equal than others, you can see that Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa here, it's a small few. It's a few people there, wealthy families, that own most of the wealth. And having a lot of income inequality is not a good thing for development. That means you have a lot of poor people, not a big middle class, and those few elite families. Not good for development. Okay? Not that you want to have, I'm not advocating pure communism here, but you want to have a better distribution of income so that poor families can develop, can have the money to send their kids to school, so that those kids can get an education, right, and go on and better their lives. When you're trying to, you're making $2 a day, you don't have much money to improve your standard of living and your children's future. So that's what this Gini coefficient is all about. At the paragraph below the map on your paper, it said that South Africa had the world's highest at 0.7. Right, so you can see how dark South Africa is here. And Slovenia was the lowest at 0.24. Right, so there's a range there. And in European countries, what they try to do is increase taxes on the wealthy so that they can spread the wealth better. All right, so Europe is more socialist than America. Think Bernie Sanders. Okay, he kind of represents socialism in America. Socialism is different than communism in the sense that people vote for it. They vote for more income equality. So if you're very wealthy, you're going to be taxed at a lot higher rate, so that money goes back to the government and can be spread to more people. Right? So that everybody has access to health care, for instance, or free college. Whatever it may be, the point of spreading that wealth is what socialism is all about. All right, now in China, communism, is different because the people don't have a choice, right? And they've kind of loosened up on their economic controls, but there's still government control. All right, so that is income distribution and how it relates to development. That's the Gini coefficient. As long as you get the concept, I wouldn't worry about memorizing the definition. All right, the next one is about fertility and mortality over time. So if you look at fertility rates, and I've included some paragraphs here that you can read over, but this one's pretty easy, so I feel like we've covered this in chapter 2. We can move kind of quickly through it. As a country develops, what happens to their fertility rates? We know this, right? As a country develops and women get an education, as a country develops and they stop farming, fewer children is actually better. If you're a farmer and everybody's staying home, it's beneficial to have a lot of help on the farm. But when you move to a city and children are expected to go to school, children become expensive. And we love you, but you're expensive. I just saw a report this morning how expensive college is going to be for children that are born today. It's $300,000 by the time those kids born today get a college education at a private university. It's cheaper at a public university. But as a parent, I was thinking to myself, I want my kid to be able to pick where they want to go to school. And I was like, $300,000. Oh my gosh. So that's why fertility rates are going down. When women get the opportunity to work outside the home, they get married later. They get an education. They're in college, right? They get married later. They want to advance their careers first. And the later you start having kids, the fewer kids you're going to have. Right? All of these are signs of development. And that's why as places develop, their fertility rates go down. And that's good for the earth, too. I have a big family. I have 4 kids, so I'm not judging. I'm just saying I know I'm bad for the earth. We use a lot of energy, right? In a developed country, we have that expectation. Mortality is the same thing. As you develop, death rate falls until you get to which stage? 5, right? This new proposed stage 5, that your country is so advanced, people are living so long and choosing to have so few children that there's actually a lot of old people. And at that point, then your accrued death rates will go back up. But in general, with development, fertility rates go down, mortality rates go down. And think about that. If you know your children are going to live, infant mortality rates go down, child mortality rates go down. You don't need to have as many. Right? That's a sign of development in healthcare. So all of these things, again, are linked. Okay, let's go on. Access to healthcare, education, utilities, and sanitation on the next page. We've talked about cities lately. And one of the reasons that so many people from rural areas move to cities is to have access to these things. No country has become developed without an increase in urbanization. So people leave rural areas seeking healthcare, seeking education for their kids because population pressures in rural areas leave them with not enough land. And they need utilities and sanitation. Now there's a problem, of course, with this in slums. We've talked about that. For 1 billion people that live in slums, not having access to clean water is a big problem. And the death rate actually rises because of that. Right? So they come to cities hoping for a better life, but may not have the skills to get a job that supports being able to afford a place to live. And so you have the growth of squatter settlements. But access to these things, if everybody in your country has access to all of these things, you are a developed country. If they don't, you're in the semi-periphery or the periphery, right? All right, so let's go on. Now, something we only briefly talked about, and I swear, I feel like they're inserting gender stuff everywhere in all of the rubrics, all of the units that I've seen for this year. So I even did one with gender and agriculture. So now this is Gender Inequality Index as a measure of development. So GII, you're going to have to try to keep all of these things straight. Gini coefficient, GII, HDI. We'll go over them, but look them over. I feel like the gender stuff, I wonder if they're going to do an FRQ on some type of gender equality. So let's cover it. GII, Gender Inequality Index, is just what it implies. Gender inequality, a way of measuring gender inequality, which means the loss of achievement. Because women aren't treated equally, is there a way of measuring that loss of potential because they aren't given the same opportunities? That's what the GII does. All right? It measures 3 things. And I have this list on your sheet here for you. Oh, no, I just put it on your sheet. I didn't put it on the PowerPoint. Health, empowerment, and labor. All right, so you measure health in how many teenagers get pregnant. In a country where women don't have a lot of rights and are married off at young ages, there's a high adolescent birth rate. That's not good for development. You also measure maternal mortality. How many women are dying in childbirth? Because that means they don't have access to health care. Empowerment. How many women are getting an education? How many women are getting elected to the government? That's empowerment. Because an education brings you power through your ability to support yourself, not need to stay in an abusive relationship, right? Have a job, an income that you can use for yourself and your children. Not all women have that, ladies. We take that for granted. And then therefore can participate in the labor market. So education, government, access. We've never had a female president, but it's not just about presidency. In fact, they measure it through Parliament or Congress. So how many women are elected to those positions? All right, so I have a couple paragraphs on gender inequality, how it's a major barrier to development. This has been a focus lately. And so you should be familiar with all of these things and the gender gap. You want equality because that means if everybody in your country is equally educated, has access, right, to work and school, your country's going to be better off. But that's not the case, and that's why they created GII. Best countries, you're looking at Europe again, Scandinavia, and worst countries, you're looking at war-torn countries, Africa, right? Saudi Arabia, where women are really oppressed, only recently got the right to drive, only recently got the right to have physical education, right? Have to be escorted by their male relatives. Okay, so I feel like we've talked about this all year. I hope there's something on gender, and read it over. All right, next section is on HDI. Do you remember this one? We kind of made a big deal about HDI. It's similar in measurement in the categories here that we've already talked about. I like this one. So, Human Development Index. How can you measure the general development of a country? Well, look at the categories. GNI per capita. So you already know what that one is. how many years do people go to school, adults and kids, and how long do people live. If you add all of these up and get that number, you're able to compare development from country to country. So notice on that sheet, it says it's a composite measure, and it's not about economic growth alone. That's why I like it. Yes, the GNI is a big deal, economic productivity, but these things really matter for development too. All right, so creating that composite, social and economic development, you should definitely memorize these categories for HDI. The map shouldn't surprise you. I hope that you've noticed that so many times there's so many similarities with these maps. The core regions, the developed regions are looking good, are very high in Human Development Index, and then countries in usually Africa, right, are the lowest. Okay, so that's HDI. I know there's a lot of these ways of measuring. But I want you to know them. On this slide, this was what I was thinking about before. I thought I had this for GII, but I had it for HDI. They're just showing you how they calculate it. And then on your paper, I have the highest and the lowest. Again, the highest are in Europe. Highest level of development. Notice this data is new compared to yours. The United States dropped. We're still in the top 10 most developed countries, but we're not the most developed according to HDI. Our economy is really strong compared to a lot of European countries, but our life expectancy is lower for a variety of reasons, including diet and including lack of access to health care, which European countries all have, especially Western Europe, which are the leaders here. The lowest HDI shouldn't surprise you either. These are all in Africa. All right, so we're almost done. Well, I'll try to speed up because I'd like to do that. All right, so this is really important, and I have about 6 minutes left. These two models I definitely need to get through right now. This is still part B, but we're finally on to number 2. So all that other stuff that I just went over, that was all ways of measuring development. Now, this is spatial patterns of economic and social development, your ability to analyze that and use models. So the first model that you need to know is Rostow's ladder of development. It's called the modernization model. How do you climb the ladder? How do you go from a traditional stage of development all the way up to this stage of high mass consumption? This is Rostow. Here it is. Do you remember this? Traditional society, and then you have investment and getting into a transitional stage where infrastructure is built so that the country can actually develop and take off through industrialization, drive to maturity, and the stage where we are, the stage of high mass consumption. So in these stages, in this stage you're doing primary, here you're transitioning from primary to secondary, here you're doing secondary and transitioning to tertiary, there you're doing tertiary. All right, this is the model of development. The idea is that all countries can climb the ladder, can go from a low stage of development to a high stage, and follow our lead. Follow the 4 Asian dragons or tigers. They did it too. So the idea is there's hope. Other people say no way. And the dependency theory was one that we talked about that is not on the rubric. It's not on the sheet of things that you have to know for the AP test. But you should be able to critique this in a way that you recognize it's not as easy for lesser developed countries to go through development the way that we do. They're competing against us now, right? How are they going to get an edge? It's more difficult in a crowded field. And so it may be harder for them to climb the ladder. All right. Wallerstein. I've been using these words all year. This is the recognition that we're all connected, but we all play a certain role in the world's economy. Right? So some countries are poor, they're producing mainly raw materials, they're farmers in the periphery. But there's hope for development. Look at BRIC, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. They've all moved into the semi-periphery. They're doing some core and some peripheral processes. Sure, there's still a lot of poverty in farmers, but they've moved on. And everybody wants to become the core, like us, like Western Europe, like Japan. But we're all connected in the world's economy. We all look at it, right? The arrows are showing what each provides. And it takes diversity into account. Not everybody's going to develop the same way, but you can develop. Okay, I want you to do the practice question, and I'll have to start with the UN Millennium Goals tomorrow. So let's look at this practice question. Rostow. Done already? You know the answer? Don't all of the words sound tempting? Right? I think it's a good question because, I mean, right now I just talked about the whole point of this, session is development. But all of these words are a part of what we've been discussing. Dependency theory says, no, you can't develop like Rostow said. Right? Because it's built into the structure of the system that core countries need the cheap labor of peripheral countries. We don't want them to get rich, then who's going to make our stuff for cheap? Right? Core periphery relations is, world systems theory. Neo-colonialism is also this, right? That even though colonies aren't colonies any longer, they're still producing the same things they did when they were colonies. They're still controlled by the core countries. So all of these words are related, and that's why I think the question's tough, especially if you weren't in context of this review session. So modernization model, though, is saying, how does a country develop? All right, so back here, same time tomorrow.